Thank you. Okay, guys, we'll go ahead and get started. Well, we're in week 7 our pipeline now, and these are just a few announcements we'll get to before we get started. The Pacific Life info session is on the 18th, so definitely show up to that. It's a good opportunity to network with recruiters. We emailed out in our weekly email the information for submitting your resume to the resume booklet. So I definitely recommend you submit to that as well, just so you can get your resume looked at by these recruiters. And the deadline for that is the 12th. So you have until this Friday to get that done. Project Showcase is scheduled for April 14th. So there's plenty of time to get a project started if you're interested in being a part of this event. It's a really cool, like, day-long event where you not only get to present your project to different company sponsors, but you also have a chance to win prizes. There's a networking event. It's really cool. Definitely think about getting involved there, and we'll have more information as we get closer to the date. Since we're kind of winding down for the quarter, we will only have one more general meeting next week. So this pipeline only meets one more time, same place, next week during week 8. In weeks 9 and for finals week, there's no meeting at all on Tuesday. And during week 10, which is dead week, we'll have a study session that you can come to. More information to come. See you next week, last normal general meeting. Some mentorship tips for the week. If you're looking to get involved in an internship or something like that, definitely do a project. That's probably the most important aspect that I could recommend for you guys, just because it's a great talking point for any interview, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a complicated project either. If you're just exploring some data, that in itself can actually be a project, as long as you have a good understanding of it and have a way to talk about it. Definitely polish up your resume. We had a resume workshop a little while ago. If you're still unsure about anything related to your resume, like formatting or content, you can pretty much reach out to any officer and you can get your resume reviewed. So take advantage of that if you can. And make sure you apply to lots of things. There's a saying, you can pretty much apply to anything at, really no cost to you other than your time. So apply to as much as you can. Okay. Whoever wrote down this tip apparently applied to over 100 jobs before getting real interviews. So definitely can seem daunting at first, but once you get into the habit of applying to things, it gets easier with time. So that's all I have for announcements. One last thing before I get started with the lesson. If any of you are PSTAT majors and you're looking to get help with like your scheduling, I know pastimes are happening right now. You can always do advising through the PSTAT department, but I myself am actually a peer advisor with the PSTAT department. So if you have a quick question about your schedule or anything related to your classes, you can always ask me. If I can, answer it in under 5 minutes, even better. Otherwise, you can make an appointment and do it that way as well. So general questions about PSTAT, you can ask me at any time. I'll be happy to answer. And we'll get started with our 6th lesson in this series, which is about unsupervised learning. If you'll remember from last week, we went over supervised learning, which is like unsupervised learning's much more structured sibling in that there's a very defined path for how you would conduct a supervised learning project. As we'll see in a moment, unsupervised learning is very different, not quite as structured as supervised learning. A couple of different methods are listed here as well. If you had a chance to look at the notebook, you'll see that we analyzed the Titanic data set with both random forest and decision trees. So the main takeaway for what the actual difference between supervised and unsupervised learning is supervised learning deals with labeled data, right? So like our Titanic data set, every passenger has a label associated with it, 0 for 0, 1 for survived or did not. With unsupervised learning problems, we don't have that same kind of structure. There really aren't any labels associated with the data. And that's a little hard to think about at first, mostly because, how can you test your model if you don't really have like a result associated with each data point? We'll see how that works in a minute. But if you have to remember anything about this, it's that supervised learning has labels, unsupervised learning, there is not. So we're going to learn about one type of unsupervised learning, which in particular is clustering. In clustering, you're basically taking your individual data points and sort of grouping them together based on similar characteristics. And at first, that sounds a lot like classification, but there are some key differences here. Classification being a supervised learning method. With respect to classification, we do know the labels of all the classes. And in clustering, we don't exactly know what groups we're putting all of our data points into, right? There are lots of different methods for clustering that you could use in a project, but the one we're going to be concerned with today is something called k-means. So again, just to reiterate, classification, you're grouping things based on some sort of decision boundary or rule or equation. In clustering, we're just looking at the inherent properties of data and sort of grouping things that are similar to one another. One pretty common example of clustering in terms of real world applications, and this has to do with the notebook as well, that has been sent out for this week, is like news articles, right? Different news articles are grouped in different topics based on what they're about. So like if you go to any news site, you'll see that you have an option to search news articles by different topics, like medicine, technology, business. Each of these categories is a form of clustering articles, right? And for each topic, you'll have articles that are only relevant to that topic. So like I said before, the pipeline for unsupervised learning is a little different. Instead of test splitting our data like we would for something that has labels associated with it, we sort of have a little bit of free rein to analyze based on different characteristics, different metrics, since we don't really have like a true label set to compare our model to. This presentation is going to have a lot of video links and references in it that you are more than welcome to look at after the fact. I definitely recommend you watch as many of these videos as you can, just because a lot of the stuff is a lot more easily visualized and something you could honestly kind of fall down the rabbit hole of in a lot longer than I can cover in like an hour or so. These are just different methods that are associated with clustering that come just from scikit-learn. And there are all sorts of things, like I said before. We're pretty much going to be only concerned with k-means at the moment. It is something you will see very often when it comes to data science projects. And when I say k-means, this is sort of an example of what k-means is. K is just a variable that stands for pretty much any number that you can designate K is the number of clusters that your model is grouping your data into. In this example, it's going to be K equals 2 clusters. You'll see in a minute, but let's say we have this specific data set here on the screen. There's no labels associated. We don't know which classes these points belong to. What we do in k-means clustering is we set 2 points of data essentially to be the centroids, or like the initialized starting point, all right, of our process. And we pick 2 random points. So what happens after that is we take the rest of the points that weren't the initial centroids, and we'll classify them based on whether or not they're closer to one centroid or the other, right? So in this case, all the points in blue are closer to the blue centroid, and all the points in red are closer to the red centroid. What we do after that is, and this is the difference between these two, you'll notice that our centroids actually move, and that's because each iteration of this process causes the centroid to move toward the mean of all the data, right? What we've done here is we've taken the mean of each of the 2 groups, and the centroids become that new mean. The process continues. We regroup, we reclassify some of the points based on the new centroids. We essentially just do the same thing we did before. You'll notice that some of the classifications have changed as a result, because as with before, some of the points like at the bottom, on the bottom left here, are now closer to one centroid, whereas before they were closer to the other. And once again, our centroids move, right? You'll notice how these 2 distinct groups are starting to get further apart in terms of classification as a result. And that's exactly what we're going for. Centroids move. This is like a live example of this process, this time with 3 groups. And this is just another example too. In this case, these are both k equals 3 examples, where we have 3 distinct clusters that we're trying to identify. Again, you'll notice that there are no distinct labels for anything, and we're really just grouping everything together based on how similar they are to one another. So that's kind of, in a way, how k-means clustering is a lot more vague than other forms of classification that you'll come across. These are just a couple of different examples of how we can cluster a single data set in several different ways. The first 2 examples are k equals 4 clusters. They're different, you'll notice, because they were both initialized with different centroids, right? Those initial centroids were at different points, and as a result, the model spat out like a different configuration, both of which are drastically different than one another, right? So just because you initialize for the same number of clusters does not mean you end up with the same groupings. With k equals 7, you have more clusters and therefore are capturing like smaller groups. So just something interesting to think about. The way we choose k is a little different in that it's not very easy to tell sometimes how many clusters there's supposed to be, since, you know, if we have a given set of data, we don't know how many clusters are supposed to be there. The thing we want to do, though, is not overgeneralize. At the same time, we don't want to have too many clusters, because then the model has no power to predict any new clusters, because they're too dissimilar from one another. The way we determine this value for k is something called the silhouette score, and it's essentially just a metric for evaluating whether or not a data point belongs to a certain cluster or not. The documentation is also listed on here, we'll look at later on, but the only thing to be concerned with at the moment is that a high silhouette score means that we have, with a large degree of confidence, that the data points that we have belong to the clusters that they're assigned to, right? Conversely, a low silhouette score would mean the opposite. We're not very confident that these data points belong to the clusters they're assigned to at all. So as with a lot of different data science related models that involve choosing a certain number of features or choosing a certain number of clusters or classes or something like that, we have this issue that we come across, right? Something called the curse of dimensionality. It was coined by an American mathematician, which basically describes this phenomenon that happens when we have very large, very complex data sets. And essentially what this means is as the dimensionality or the complexity of our data set increases, our data points start to increase in terms of error. The second bullet point here, nearest neighbors and the curse of dimensionality, is actually sort of like a TED talk or a presentation related to dimensionality and KNN, and it's a pretty interesting watch if you have time for that. Main takeaway here is that if we have too many features in our data, we run into issues, right? Because we have relatively simple algorithms, and they're not that great at modeling super complex data sets. We do better when we have more simplified things to work with. So the solution to this particular issue is we can actually reduce the dimensions of our data. That's something that's a little difficult to visualize, but basically we can take a lot of the variance of our data out, and we can, in a way, describe our data based on the most important features. So like, for example, if we had our Titanic data set with all the different class features, say we didn't want to analyze every single feature about each passenger, we could very easily describe the variance in the data just based off of a couple features. You could say maybe the sex of the passenger is more important, and we can effectively reduce the number of features and use just a few to cluster or classify or whatever we're trying to do with it. Two different methods for this: principal component analysis and single value decomposition, SVD. These are two different methods that we can use to transform the data into its most informational space, right? PCA in particular, you'll probably come across quite a bit. In it, we essentially want to compress our data into the dimensions that have the greatest variance, right? So along the longer line, PCA first dimension is where the data has most variable, right? And then to a lesser degree along the second dimension. So that's kind of what this is here. This is PCA, an example of PCA. So we have all this data that's sort of randomly scattered throughout this plot. What you'll notice is that the points that are furthest away from each other describe the greatest variance of our data set, right? If we're going to conduct PCA using some sort of system or algorithm or package, we would want to reduce along this axis. What you end up with is something that looks like this, where your data is sort of like compressed to this line. And you end up with like a bunch of points in a smaller dimension, see? Instead of having multiple dimensions, now we're only concerned with one. And if you wanted to classify all of these, you could very easily do so in a smaller dimension. One pretty common project example for clustering has to do with like document topics, right? If you've heard about this, it's related to like news article topics. We went over this a little earlier. Basically, the issue is you're given a bunch of text data That's just a bunch of different articles, right? Articles that have no distinct labels or no topics associated with them. And we have to figure out a way to cluster documents of a similar topic together just based off of their content alone, right? From this, we can kind of get a data set where each row is a different article and the columns are just words. Words that the documents all contain. Some will have them, some will not. But this idea of term frequency or inverse document frequency is like a statistic that reflects how important a word is to a collection of documents. It's very specific to document information. The equation itself isn't super important, but the only thing to note here is that we have different articles that contain different kinds of words in them. They'll each be associated with a different score depending on the words they contain that are independent of other articles in that same group, right? Say we like have two sentences, we'll call them articles for now. Each of these sentences has a different score associated with each of the words present in that article or sentence. You'll notice that since the words I and am and walking both are present in each article or each sentence, their value is 0, right? And that's because the total number of documents over the number of documents containing those 3 words basically equal out to 1. And as you know, the log of 1 is just 0. So that's why these words, I and walking, they don't help you to differentiate between these 2 sentences at all because they both contain them. On the other hand, the words dogs and cats, one article contains it and the other doesn't. So that's kind of a way that you can tell that there's a difference between these 2, right? They have a higher score associated with them as a result. And that's pretty much a brief overview of what the notebook is going to be. These are posted in the chat as per usual. If you have any questions, like I said, about any of this stuff, the notebooks for past weeks, anything else about data science or the club in general, I'll be here for a few minutes after lecture. Yeah, that's it. All I have for you guys this week. You're free to go. I hope you guys will get all the classes that you need. And I'll hope to see you next week.